You reach for the shaker before you've even tasted the food. 2 shakes on the eggs. 1 more, out of habit, before the fork even reaches your mouth. It isn't really about hunger anymore. It's closer to checking a phone that hasn't buzzed, a reflex your body runs without asking your permission. That white crystal used to be worth more than the meal underneath it. For nearly all of human history, salt wasn't a seasoning. It was survival, and it was nowhere near this easy to find. Your body needs about 0.5 gram of sodium a day just to keep its nerves firing and its blood pressure steady. For hundreds of thousands of years, getting that 0.5 gram was one of the harder problems a human body ever had to solve. So here's what doesn't quite add up. If salt was this rare, why does your body still crave it like your life depends on it? And why, the moment humans finally learned to make it on purpose, did entire empires start fighting wars over it? People were boiling salt water into crystals almost 3,000 years before anyone on Earth had invented a written word. What your ancestors went through for a single pinch of this might explain why you still can't put the shaker down. Sodium does more in your body than make food taste better. It carries the electrical charge that fires every nerve. It holds water inside your blood vessels so your blood pressure doesn't collapse. Lose too much of it, through sweat, through illness, through simple scarcity, and your whole system starts to misfire. So evolution built in a warning system. A craving, sharp and specific, that switches on the second sodium runs low. Researchers who study this call it sodium appetite, and it does not politely ask for a little. Deprive a person, or an animal, of sodium, and given the chance, they will overcorrect hard eating far more than they actually need to fix the shortfall. It isn't a preference. It's closer to a fire alarm wired straight into your brainstem, one that has no idea it's currently going off in a kitchen with a shaker sitting 3 feet away. If you've ever craved something salty after a long run, a bad night of sleep, or a hard cry, that's the same ancient circuit firing. It has no idea the shortage. It's protecting you from stopped being a real threat thousands of years ago. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind, though. If the craving is this old and this powerful, how did anyone survive long enough to pass it on? If salt was scarce, how did early humans get enough of it in the first place? For most of the Stone Age, the answer is they mostly didn't have to look for it separately at all. Meat carries sodium in its blood and its tissue. Certain roots and tubers hold small amounts too. A diet built on wild game, foraged plants, and whatever grew nearby was already delivering a slow, steady trickle of sodium, just enough to survive on, wrapped inside far more potassium than any modern diet comes close to. In places far from any coastline, some communities simply followed the same instinct every other animal on the landscape was already following. Natural mineral deposits, salt licks, that drew deer, buffalo, and every other plant eater for miles. Track the animals to the lick, and you'd usually find people there too. No fast food, no bag of chips, no pretzel dipped in more salt than the food it's wrapped around. Just meat, tubers, and whatever sodium happened to be hiding quietly inside them. Here's where it gets interesting. A small number of communities on Earth today still live something close to that original arrangement, and researchers have studied them closely since the 1970s. One of the most striking is the Yanomami, a rainforest community in the Amazon basin, whose average daily sodium intake measures out to a fraction of what the average American eats without thinking twice. And here's the part that flips a common assumption. Most people take it for granted that blood pressure climbing with age is just what happens to a body as it gets older. It isn't. Among the Yanomami, blood pressure barely rises at all across an entire lifetime. Researchers at Johns Hopkins compared them directly to a neighboring tribe with slightly more exposure to processed salted food and found that tribe's blood pressure did creep upward with age, in a way the Yanomamis never did. Rising blood pressure with age isn't a fact of biology. It looks a lot more like a side effect of a diet, nothing like the one your body was actually built to expect. Similar patterns have shown up in other remote, low-salt populations. Researchers have studied since, from the Amazon basin to hunter-gatherer communities in Central Africa. The story keeps repeating itself. Less added salt, flatter blood pressure over a lifetime, no matter the continent. But something changed once humans stopped foraging and started farming. Grain-heavy diets carry far less natural sodium than a diet built on wild meat. Stored food, dried food, food meant to survive an entire winter without refrigeration needed something ordinary crops simply didn't provide on their own. The craving hadn't gone anywhere. The problem was, the food supply that used to satisfy it quietly had disappeared out from under it. So people started making salt on purpose, and archaeologists have found exactly where. At a site called Poiana Slatinei in Romania, researchers uncovered the remains of fire pits and broken clay vessels clustered beside a natural salt spring, evidence that people were boiling brine down into crystals of salt there roughly 8,000 years ago. This wasn't a lucky accident. It took someone noticing that spring water tasted different, then tending a fire for hours, then building crude clay vessels strong enough to hold boiling brine without cracking, just to end up with a small crust of crystals at the bottom. Let that sink in for a second. That's before the wheel existed anywhere, before writing had been invented anywhere on Earth, before the pyramids, by more than 3,000 years. On the other side of the continent, at a coastal site in northern England called Street House, archaeologists found nearly identical evidence, hearths and brine pits dated almost 2,000 years later. Two communities, thousands of miles apart, with no contact between them, independently arriving at the exact same solution to the exact same problem, because the same craving was pushing both of them toward it. Every method used to make salt today, whether it's evaporated out of seawater in shallow pans or mined straight out of underground deposits, still traces back to those same two basic ideas, discovered independently, by accident, next to a spring or a coastline, thousands of years before anyone had a word for chemistry. Once people could produce more salt than they needed just to survive, something else happened. It stopped being food. It became money. There's a piece of this story most people get slightly wrong. You've probably heard that Roman soldiers were literally paid in salt, and that supposedly is where the word salary comes from. Here's the part almost nobody mentions. Historians have gone through Roman military records, and there isn't a single surviving ancient source that confirms soldiers were ever handed actual blocks of salt as payment. What's real is almost as interesting. Roman soldiers received an allowance called the salarium, likely tied to buying salt, because Rome considered the stuff essential enough to build an entire road, the Via Salaria, purely to move it into the capital. Nobody was hauling a shaker home in a rucksack on payday. Rome just cared enough about salt to pave a highway for it. Half a world away, and centuries later, the same pattern showed up completely independently. Starting around the 8th century, camel caravans crossed 1,000 miles of open Sahara, from salt mines like Taghaza and Taudeni, each animal loaded with slabs of rock salt, cut so heavy that a single slab could weigh as much as 90 kilograms, hauling them down to trading cities like Timbuktu, where merchants exchanged the slabs for gold dust pulled from mines further south. You may have heard that salt was traded there pound for pound against gold. Historians now think that specific detail is probably an exaggeration, born from early travelers misreading a silent barter custom used between traders who didn't share a language. But even without an exact weight-for-weight trade, salt genuinely rivaled gold in value across parts of West Africa for centuries, worth risking a life in open desert to move. In China, rulers took the idea a step further. In 1109 BCE, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty formalized a state monopoly on salt and iron, specifically to fund military campaigns against nomadic rivals on the northern frontier. It worked because there was no way around it. Every household needed salt, so every household paid, whether they noticed the tax or not. It generated so much revenue that it sparked one of history's most famous economic arguments, a formal court debate in 81 BCE over whether a government should be allowed to control something every single person needs simply to stay alive. Across completely unconnected civilizations, separated by oceans and thousands of years, we kept arriving at exactly the same realization. Whoever controls the salt controls the people who need it. All of that for something you can now buy in bulk for less than the price of a coffee. Here's the number that ties all of it back to you. The average person today eats somewhere around 3.5 grams of sodium a day, most of it without ever touching a shaker, hidden in bread, sauces, and packaged food. Researchers estimate a body living entirely off wild, foraged food, the way yours was designed to, took in less than 1 gram of sodium a day from all sources combined. That isn't a small gap. That's close to 4 times the amount your ancestors' bodies ever had to plan around, delivered to a body whose warning system never got updated. You reach for the shaker without thinking, the same reflex checking a phone that hasn't buzzed. Except now, you know a little more about what that reflex actually cost. Roads were paved for this. Empires argued over who got to control it. People crossed open desert on camelback, risking their lives, to trade it for gold. We built entire systems of government around something your ancestors' bodies had already learned, hundreds of thousands of years earlier, to crave without being told why. Somewhere between a fire pit beside a Romanian salt spring and the shaker sitting on your table tonight, salt stopped being rare. It happened slowly enough that no single generation ever noticed the shortage disappearing. Your body never got the message. It is still bracing for a scarcity that ended thousands of years ago, and it will keep whispering for more long after there was ever any reason left to listen.